Welcome back from the workshops. If you wish you could have done another one, you can go back online on the Sketch app and watch the recording. We'll have that available for you. This session is around the area of substance use disorder, and we are very privileged to have Stephan Lambert from Orange County Department of Education, an expert in youth prevention in the area of substance use. He has 14 years of experience with positive youth development, family and community engagement, and developmental asset building. In his role at Orange County Department of Education, he supports schools and districts with training and technical assistance around alcohol, tobacco, and other drug prevention. Please welcome Stephan Lambert.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I think my video will start shortly. And in the meantime, I will begin my screen share. So thank you. As Dr. Morgan mentioned, my name is Stephan Lambert, and I work at the Orange County Department of Education. I'm your neighbor to the west, and I am the prevention coordinator here at the Orange County Department of Ed. And my specialty is substance use prevention. And today, what I want to be talking to you about is substance use and human trafficking with a focus on illicit fentanyl. So we'll get things started right away. I want to talk a little bit about how substance use relates to human trafficking, because I feel like we have to start with this understanding before we talk about the issues that are happening right now with our young people and across our country. Starting with the role of substance use as a means of recruitment, a means of control within human trafficking, and as a complex risk factor. And let me describe for you what that means. So when we look at the risk factors related to human trafficking, social isolation, trauma, and economic hardship are really at the heart. And in and amidst those three, you'll find very often substance use and mental health disorders, as well as family, peer, and dating violence, both of which are these complex cycles that relate to one another, can be very intergenerational, all in this context of marginalization, whether we're talking about the LGBTQ community, young people who have foster care involvement, who are experiencing homelessness, incarceration, immigration status, other factors, race, ethnicity, the list goes on. But marginalization is one of the underpinnings of many of these risk factors as well. So when you look at the 5 most common risk factors for sex trafficking in 2020, according to the Polaris Project's Human Trafficking Hotline, number 5 is recent migration or relocation. 4 is a mental health concern. 3 is unstable housing. 2 is runaway or homeless youth. And number 1 is a substance use concern. So as you can see, it's quite relevant to what we're talking about when we're discussing substance use. And when you look at the 5 most common methods of control for sex trafficking in 2020, again, per the Polaris Project, you see here inducing or exploiting substance use issues is number 3, right above physical abuse and intimidation. So we know that when it comes to sex trafficking, substance use is so intricately involved and related. And like I mentioned before, very intergenerational. You know, the substance use disorders and addiction can cause so many of these other risk factors to be strengthened in our young people. So keep that all of that in mind as I dive into tonight's specific topic, which is counterfeit pills and illicit fentanyl. So we're going to get started by talking about what is fentanyl? What is this? What are we discussing here? What are some of the data and the trends that we need to be aware of? What are counterfeit pills and how does that relate to this issue? And then what can we do about it? Oh, I'm encountering a little bit of a tech issue. Is Can you all still see and hear everything okay? Just want to be sure everything's still working on your end. Okay, I'm not hearing any response. Let me just.
We can still hear you on our side.
Everything's fine. Great. Thank you so much. One of my monitors decided to black out right now. So I was worried you couldn't see anything. I will continue. So, what is fentanyl? Fentanyl is a powerful synthetic opioid that's used for severe pain relief. But in order to understand it, we have to define it. So, what do these words mean? And I like to actually move backwards in this definition, starting with the word opioid. So, an opioid is any of these drugs that relieves pain by attaching to our nerve cells, right, that run throughout our brain and body. And the name comes from, of course, the opium poppy, from which the original opioids like morphine and heroin came from. However, in this case with fentanyl, we're discussing something that is synthetic. So it doesn't come from opium poppies. It's synthesized from lab-made chemicals, which has a lot to do with how cheap it is to produce and why it is so prevalent right now. And finally, powerful. When we say that fentanyl is powerful, we mean that it is 50 to 100 times as strong as opioids like morphine and heroin. So this is an extraordinarily potent drug. When you look at a visual representation, over on the left, you can see a lethal dose of heroin, and over on the right is a lethal dose of fentanyl. And you can see a marked difference in how little is needed to create a very dangerous reaction when it comes to fentanyl. Visualized another way, this is a lethal dose of fentanyl on the tip of a number 2 pencil. So again, you can see a very minute amount and a very concentrated drug. Before we move on, I do want to clarify that when we're talking about fentanyl, we're not discussing the pharmaceutical medication that's being used in hospitals, healthcare settings, hospice care. I don't want to cause any panic about that. I don't want folks to stop taking the medications, that sort of thing. What we're discussing here is illicit fentanyl. So this is being manufactured by transnational criminal organizations, sometimes called cartels, and being mixed into street drugs and counterfeit pills, which we're going to discuss in detail later. But I just wanted to make that distinction as we move forward, so we're all on the same page. So to talk about this issue, I wanted to show you what's going on countrywide and also as well specifically in Arizona. To get things started, I wanted to pitch a question to you all about what do you think is the leading cause of accidental death in the United States? Do you think that it's car crashes? Do you think that it's falls? Or do you think that it is drugs? So I'll give you a minute to think about that. I know a lot of you aren't in the Zoom, so you can't put it in the chat. If you are, please feel free to do so, which one you think is correct. For those of you who are in person, just hold it in your head. Okay, so we've got some different answers here: falls, drugs. Typically, I get a lot for car crashes, but it is sort of a spoiler, right? It's a leading question that I'm here to talk about substance use. It is drug poisoning. So that may surprise some of you that drug poisoning actually surpassed motor vehicle injuries as the leading cause of accidental death in the US quite a few years ago. And it's not that car crashes fell so much as drug poisonings were increasing, largely in concert with the opioid crisis. But you can see there that intense spike in just the last year. And this chart doesn't include 2021, in which the number topped 100,000 deaths in the last 12 months. So an absolutely astounding increase. When you look at Arizona specifically, and I pulled this from your Department of Health Services, between 2019 and 2020, there was a 45% increase in opioid-related deaths in Arizona. When you look at the age ranges in which these deaths were occurring, this is specific to 2021. So in the last year, you can see the majority of these deaths, unfortunately, occurring among our young adults, particularly the 25 to 34-year-old range. This is very similar to what we're experiencing here in California and in Orange County, where I live. However, when you look at the 0 to 17-year-olds, you might say, well, it's only 2.3%. Perhaps we shouldn't be overly concerned. However, when you look at year over year, this is the opioid-related deaths in Arizona for that age group. You can see a sharp increase again between 2019 and 2020, in which 26 deaths occurred in 2019 and 59 in 2020. So again, you see that sharp increase, very similar to what we're seeing here in California and nationwide. If you look at non-fatal overdoses in Arizona, you also see an astounding increase in the involvement of fentanyl. So these are well, I don't know if I would say fortunately, but overdoses that did not result in death. And you can see fentanyl completely overshadowing or exploding in terms of prevalence over the past few years. And again, very similar to what we're seeing in California. So then this raises the question, how is this happening? Why are all of these incidents involving fentanyl skyrocketing? And a lot of it comes down to something called counterfeit pills. So we're talking about fake pills here. So to give you a visual, I have a couple of pills here, both of them claiming to be oxycodone. Now, again, in the chat or just to yourself, which of these two pills do you think is a legitimate oxycodone pill? Both of these are photographs from the DEA. Which one of these do you think is the real oxycodone? And which is maybe the fake one? Okay, so maybe B's the real one. So whether you said A or you thought it was B, it's actually neither. Both of these are counterfeit, and it's so extraordinarily difficult to tell. There are just so many of these pills being pressed, and I'll explain a little bit more about how they're being made in a minute. But I wanted to tell you that the DEA says that they seized 2.6 million of these fake pills in just 2019. But how much do you think this increased in 2021? Just think to yourself, what do you think that number was last year? And I guarantee you it was probably higher than you thought it was. It was 20 million. So they seized almost a tenfold increase of pills in last year in just 2 years. So you can see the complication is that the supply of these pills that are claiming to be prescription medications like oxycodone, Valium, Xanax is exploding. And these pills do not contain the real drug, but contain fentanyl instead. These organizations are using these pill presses, like you see pictured here, to churn out thousands and millions of these pills. You can see on the right-hand side some counterfeit Xanax being produced. And virtually indistinguishable, particularly to the lay person. And they have all the markings, the numbers, the symbols on them that look very legitimate. So this slide is interesting. I have these chocolate chip cookie dough balls here, and it's not because it's dinner time and I'm hungry and really want a chocolate chip cookie, but because I wanted to present you a bit of a metaphor here for how these pills are becoming so deadly. So when you're mixing chocolate chip cookies, you may have one ball of dough that has 2 or 3 chips, and the next one might have 7 or 8. So just like the chocolate chips in this cookie dough, when you're making these illicit fentanyl pills, it's not evenly distributed. So you may have one pill that has less fentanyl, and you may have another pill that has much more. So when you see this uneven distribution of the fentanyl throughout the powder in these pills, it's not surprising that 4 out of the 10 counterfeit pills that were seized and tested by the DEA had a potentially fatal dose of fentanyl, 42%. So the odds are not good. And a lot of this is what's driving these overdoses, or I should really say fentanyl poisonings, because people who are taking these very often have no idea that they're taking fentanyl and believe they're taking another pill. So what types of pills are we talking about? Well, earlier I had alluded to this. There are a few categories of medications that we're seeing most prominently when it comes to counterfeit pills. Number one, opioids, which makes sense. Fentanyl is an opioid. So things like oxycodone, Vicodin. Then you have stimulants like Adderall or Ritalin, typically used for treating ADHD. And then depressants like Xanax or Valium. These 3 categories of medications are the most commonly misused medications here in the United States among young people. And all 3 of these categories of drugs are turning up as counterfeits. So the cartels who are manufacturing these pills are churning out all of these types of drugs as counterfeits containing fentanyl. And it might be somewhat surprising to see stimulants in there because whereas with opioids and depressants, they have kind of a similar action. But with stimulants, you would think it would be the exact opposite. And yet, not only is fentanyl prevalent in all three of these drug categories, but in all sorts of street drugs, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, absolutely everything is being tainted with fentanyl, primarily because it is just so cheap to produce and traffic into the United States. So what can we do? Now that we sort of understand the issue, we understand that fentanyl is so powerful, creating a lot of illness and death here in the United States, and these counterfeit pills are largely to blame. What can we do as a community who's interested in the health and well-being of our young people, of our communities at large? I wanted to start by discussing some of the populations of concern when it comes to fentanyl use and how it's affecting people. So, number one, of course, as I've been focusing on, young people who are just starting to misuse medications, and maybe they think, oh, experimenting with Xanax or Oxycodone could be a safer way for me to explore drug use or substance use, not understanding that these pills are so incredibly lethal now. Second is people in recovery from substance use whose tolerance may be sharply diminished. And again, they may not understand the risk that's inherent in some of these pills. A lot has changed in just the past few years, as we've talked about. And finally, people who lack affordable access to medications. So it is not just young people who are attempting to misuse medications who are experiencing these fentanyl poisonings, but also people who are struggling to afford their medicines and turning to cheap online pharmacies that they think will save them money, but are in fact entities who are selling counterfeit pills, masquerading as legitimate medications, which is absolutely heartbreaking. So, what can we do to address these issues? Number one, communicate the risks when it comes to fentanyl and these counterfeit pills, making sure that everybody understands this issue and is aware of the problem. Two, thinking about naloxone, and I'll describe what that is later on in case you are not familiar. And then finally, reducing stigma, I think is incredibly important when we talk about increasing access to mental health supports as well as substance use treatment before we reach that stage where young people are past the point of experimentation even and involved in a substance use disorder. So when we talk about communicating the risks, I wanted to emphasize a few key messages for you for your consideration when we're discussing this issue with young people or the community at large. I think the first important message to communicate is that safer isn't safe. Whether we're talking about pills versus street drugs or vaping and versus smoking, a lot of young people perceive medication misuse as a less stigmatized version of substance use. This pill came from a pharmacy, it's safe, it's not dirty, it's not a street drug. We really need to rewrite that narrative because, as you can all see, that is no longer the case. And whether it's a counterfeit medication or not, young people have to understand that any drug, whether illegal or legal, whether it's prescription or not, counterfeit or not, can affect the brain and the body, particularly when we're talking about young people and their development. And so, something can be bad without being the absolute worst thing out there. So, eliminating that sort of comparison that makes it young people more likely to misuse prescription medications. Second, I would say the one of the other important messages to share is that it's all about greed. Talking with young people about the root of this issue. Why do people sell fakes? Young people are very aware of counterfeit goods when it comes to shoes, handbags, or I like to discuss with young people buying things off of wish.com, right? We've all seen the things on social media where somebody thinks they're buying a coffee mug and instead they get a photo of a coffee mug in an envelope, right? And, it's sort of a lighthearted way to discuss the issue, but honestly, they understand that counterfeit goods in general are all about generating money. And it's one thing when you get ripped off for a pair of shoes, but now this issue is so incredibly dangerous. Being sold a fake pill or fake shoes is the same reasoning. Someone is trying to make money at your cost, right? And in this case, the cost is so much higher. So helping them to understand that this is about greed and they can't trust the pills that they're buying off of social media. And finally, knowing your pharmacy. I know when I was speaking earlier about those online pharmacies and some of them selling counterfeit drugs, I think it's important for other folks who are not attempting to misuse medications, but are simply struggling with the affordability to use only trusted online pharmacies. There's a link here that you'll all have access to the slides that's clickable. And that will lead you to the National Association of Board Pharmacy, I believe. And they have a list, and you can check to see if the online pharmacy that you are looking at is a legitimate pharmacy or not. And of course, there are programs to assist with medication costs. So really, really trying to encourage that. Naloxone, as I mentioned earlier, is a medication most commonly seen as Narcan nasal spray. And this is a medication that can reverse an opioid poisoning, particularly with fentanyl, but also other opioids. Things to know about naloxone is that you don't need a prescription. And I checked also in Arizona, this applies. You do not need a prescription to obtain naloxone. It's absolutely harmless to administer to someone if there are no opioids present, so it won't make you sick. So if you suspect an overdose or opioid poisoning, you can administer it without any risk of doing harm. And finally, there are trainings to learn how to identify the signs of drug poisoning, administer naloxone, and how you're protected by Good Samaritan laws. And I do want to encourage folks to just consider naloxone much like an EpiPen, right? This is a medication that can be used during a dangerous medical emergency, trying to reduce the stigma around it, particularly if there are people in your life who are struggling with a substance use disorder, that we should feel empowered to purchase this and carry it. I keep it with me in my work bag just in case. But also to show that it's not something that we need to be embarrassed about or second guessing, and it's something that can save lives in the right hands. So speaking of stigma, that this is kind of the final point that I want to make, which is that so many of the issues that we have and so many of these cascading risk factors deal with stigma, right? And our perceptions of people's behaviors and their choices. And there's just a few words here that I don't use anymore: drug habit, addict, substance abuse. So you'll note that I'm using the term substance use constantly throughout this presentation, because research has found that when you use words like this, it can change the way that you work with people and even how we sometimes assign blame when it comes to treatment for people who are dealing with a substance use disorder. And words do matter. There's a resource there that I've linked from NIDA. But that's just a small piece of the puzzle. I think that by being more open about discussing these issues and being candid with young people and encouraging them to think about who they can turn to as a trusted adult if they start to have these issues or think about substance use, whether it's their parents, teachers, counselors, tribal leaders, having that availability of a trusted adult is so, so crucial, and having those conversations in a safe place. I'm going to close here with just some resources. Again, these will be clickable in the slides that I've uploaded into the SCED, but there are a few resources from drugfree.org around parenting practices to reduce the likelihood of substance use among children, a guidebook specific to heroin, fentanyl, and opioids and finding treatment, that sort of thing, and as well as a guide to what naloxone is and how it works. And so those are great primers. You can access those all through the slides. And as I close, I just want to circle back here to this slide, thinking about all of these interconnected risk factors that I've discussed and how they tie into human trafficking. And you can imagine that when we're talking about the fentanyl overdoses and deaths and poisonings, how much that can interact with these cycles and create so much trauma for young people, even if they are not the one who's affected personally by the death, and how it just continues to drive so many of these issues. And these ripple effects, we have to be ready to address them in the best way that we can. But I would also suggest that another ripple effect is relevant, and that is the care and concern that we show to young people and to our community, and the impact that we have on individuals and young people, and the way that we demonstrate care to them can ripple out and counter all of these risk factors. So I thank you all for everything that you're doing to reduce human trafficking and to address it, and to create a safer community for all.
Stephen, thank you so much for presenting. It's so hard not to get to see you and let people ask you questions. Sketch does have an opportunity for you to send in your questions. And while we won't have time to do that live, we will collect those questions and get answers for you. Thank you also, Stephen, for making that PowerPoint with all the links available on our Sketch apps. That was wonderful. We are going to take a short break as we prepare for the next plenary, and we look forward to seeing you in the next Sketch link. Thank you.